All right, welcome to the third part of mixing with 5 plugins. This time we'll be tackling compression. Got my compressor open here. But before we start, I want to recap the last video and what we learned from EQ. So number one, we put an EQ on every track, as you can see here, and try to make everything fit together as best as we could. Some problems can't be fixed with EQ because of their dynamic problems, like you kind of heard with the vocals. Even though I use EQ on every track, don't think that you always need to. Some of the tracks, like the snare, for instance, which is open here, don't necessarily need EQ if you feel like it sounds great as it is. Maybe all it needs is a little filtering just for low end control. The reason I try to EQ every track here is that it wouldn't be much of a tutorial video if I didn't at least try to find a frequency problem with every track. But like I said, you might have tracks in your mixes, and not just in this multi-track that you have, but in other sessions of yours, that you don't feel the need to EQ because you might have recorded them exactly as you want them to sound, and then you don't want to slap an EQ on it, and that's perfectly fine. So I started by EQing the buses that were grouped by instruments, and then did minor tweaking on the individual tracks. I feel like this method makes you a faster mixing engineer, but if you like doing things from the bottom up by starting on the tracks, starting on the kick drum, or whatever method you feel most comfortable with, feel free to disregard these methods. All right, and then after EQ adjustments and other mixing techniques in general, you will often need to rebalance the faders or rebalance using either gain plugins or the gain input and outputs on the actual plugins so that the instruments all sit back to where you wanted the balance to be at the beginning. All right, let's get started on the compression here. First things first, let's talk about the common parameters and knobs you'll find on your compressor. I'll be using the FabFilter Pro C because, again, it's great for tutorial purposes. However, we will be diving into some other compressors later on in the video. First off, let's talk about the threshold and the ratio. So we're going to talk a little bit about the parameters before we start working. The threshold basically sets the level for where the compressor should start listening to the audio signal. If the audio is very low in level and the threshold is too high, and by high I mean closer to 0. So high, it's not an absolute number. So I basically say threshold is lower when it is more negative, basically. So if you're a mathematician and you like absolute values, this is actually backwards, because higher by absolute values means higher numbers and you disregard the minus sign. But in this case, a higher threshold is closer to 0 dB. And if the audio is very low in level and the threshold is too high, it won't hear the signal, so it will effectively be useless. It's not going to be doing anything. Say the audio level is just coming up to minus 25 or 24, what this is here. Say the audio signal is just right here, and you have the threshold set to here. So basically, this is where it will start working, but if the audio never reaches that level, it won't do anything. So any other parameters that you've set won't matter because the compressor doesn't start working until the audio hits the threshold. All right, ratio. This is the amount of compression. So if you have a specific level go over the threshold and the ratio is 2:1, then it will divide the level in half and compress it down by 2, basically letting half of it go over the threshold. So the higher the ratio, the more extreme the compression. 10:1 and higher is usually called limiting, because any signal over the threshold gets compressed so hard that it gets pushed down to where the threshold sits instead of letting some of it through. Okay, so basically those two parameters work in tandem. Many compressors only have these two parameters and nothing else, and then they're basically used for the type of compression they do because they have a built-in way of doing attack and release and knee and such. And they're used for how they treat the signal and give it a specific color. But we have all the parameters here, so we might as well go through them. But since we want to know how everything works, let's check out the next set of knobs here, the attack and release. The attack is basically the amount of time you give the compressor before it reacts to the incoming signal. If the attack is fast, it'll compress immediately after reaching the threshold. If the attack is slower, it will take a minute to react. Picking the right attack time is crucial for shaping sounds because it can change the way the transients of the audio signal is affected. For instance, if you have a really clicky kick drum and you want to reduce the transient of the kick coming through, you can have a very fast attack so that it kind of thickens or smooths out that initial transient of the kick drum signal. But however, the opposite is also true, that if you want that beater coming through it and you don't want to compress that part of the signal, you can make the attack a little slower so that initial transient actually comes through without being affected by the compressor. All right, release. This is the opposite. Obviously, it decides when to stop compressing. Faster release times means faster recovery time for the compressor. Longer release times means it keeps the signal compressed for longer, which can result in pumping with very rhythmic signals because the audio is never allowed to go back to its uncompressed initial audio. So if you have like a drum beat that is constantly playing a particular rhythm and you have a long release time, you'll never let that audio signal go back to its uncompressed state, and it causes this kind of pumping sound. All right, those 4 parameters are usually the most important ones to keep in mind on any compressor, but the Pro C also has a few extra things going on. The knee here, whether you select a soft or hard knee, will change the way the compression is applied, either gradually as the signal approaches the threshold or linearly as soon as the audio hits the threshold and after that. Some styles have a specific way of doing the knee or have a specific set knee. So like I said before, certain compressor plugins or compressors in general are designed for a specific sound in mind, which means that you don't have access to all the parameters. You can't change from soft to hard knee. That's just the way those compressors sound. All right, so style, which basically is what I was talking about, is the Pro C has a few different compression styles, all of which work for different instruments or for specific compression characteristics. The clean is just a straightforward soft knee clean compressor. The classic, which models more vintage compressors that react differently to the audio that's run through it, and then the opto, which is a slower acting compressor that is possibly modeled a little bit after the famous LA2A, although don't quote me on that as fact, and we'll use that later in the video as well. Depending on the style of music and instrument you're running through the compressor, these styles will change the way the compressor works on your audio, so it's worth to experiment a bit until you find what style you like the most and what fits the song. And then input and output. This is important for gain staging purposes and obviously changes according to the level of the signal you're feeding into the compressor. If you have a very quiet signal, you might need to put the gain up a bit so that the compressor works better, or down if you can't put the threshold low enough and it's always compressing way too much. A good rule of thumb is to increase the output according to the same amount you're compressing, but I like leaving it on auto. That's just kind of what I do. And then I just make sure that whenever I'm compressing, and this is something I really recommend, is make sure you don't get a drastic level difference when you bypass the compressor, because it'll make you think that everything sounds better when it's actually just sounding louder. So if the compressor is actually making the signal sound worse, but because it's louder and you think it sounds better, that's actually a pretty bad trap to be stuck in. So make sure that when you're bypassing and pushing the on and off switch on your compressor, that it's actually not jumping drastically in level, because you won't be able to make an unbiased decision of whether it sounds better compressed or uncompressed. And then you have the dry mix here. The dry mix knob in this case is a way for you to add in a bit of the uncompressed signal, which can come in handy if you want to do direct parallel compression without using sends and buses. This is on a lot of compressors. I think it's even on the Logic compressor here, even though it's basically is this input output or mix knob here. So it's in a lot of plugins, so you can always do parallel compression on the actual track itself if you so want to. And then you have the metering window. The window is handy for seeing the waveform on screen, which you'll see later, and it also shows you what the compressor is doing to the signal, and it helps to see how much gain reduction is going on by looking at the meters. All right, let's move on to working on the track itself, and I'll just put a compressor on every track, and then I'll start doing some stuff with it, and then I'll show you what I did.